A very warm welcome to you all to join the World Higher Education Conference 2022. Thanks for joining the panel, the roundtable today with a theme focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. It's a true honor of me. This is Ka-Ho Mok from Lingnan University in Hong Kong, China, to have a group of distinguished speakers to share with us about the impact of COVID-19 on higher education development. And we are so fortunate to have a beautiful weather today, and at the same time a very comfortable infrastructure, including the venues today. Shall we put our hands together, thanking the organizer for organizing an important event today. Thank you. In the last 2 years, I'm sure world leaders, educators, and different leading people around the world should have experienced very difficult time because of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. To myself and my colleagues, it's truly a humbling experience. And this unprecedented global health crisis should have humbled many people, and going through this difficult time is always opportunities, but also crises and challenges. Today, I'm so lucky to have a group of distinguished academics coming together to reflect upon the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on higher education development. But when talking about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on higher education, we cannot, just focus on only teaching and learning, but many aspects, every aspect of our normal operation being affected and disrupted by the sudden outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure when we look back about 2 years ago, when we suddenly saw about the outbreak of this pandemic, most of the university system put their education experience online, talking about emergent online learning experience. I'm so thankful for UNESCO for inviting me and my team for doing a desktop and also consulting experts all around the world, at least to know and reflect upon the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on higher education from the policy and dimension. So today I would like to briefly highlight this brief report to you. As I mentioned, when we talk about the impact, it shouldn't be easy because it covers a lot of aspects, our daily operation, not only locally, but regionally and globally. And what makes the situation even worse is about the closing down of borders, national borders, and with the emergence of new geopolitics affecting about international relations, which trickle down into the impact on higher education collaboration. But today I want to limit myself in this presentation focusing on 4 major aspects highlighting about the impact on higher education. Number 1, I think core to our business in education is about our student learning, teaching and learning. And second, we will talk about the impact on research. And the third aspect I want to touch upon about higher education finance being affected and interrupted by COVID-19 pandemic. Last but not least, we'll be talking about the impact on student mobility. And I'm sure colleagues joining this conference today, you would go for other sections. They would be focusing on other important but related topics in relation to higher education development under the context of COVID-19 pandemic situation. So while the pandemic caused campus closure around the world in 2020, it seems to have more lasting effects on low-income and low-middle-income countries. When we are so fortunate to have the infrastructure today to sit comfortably, having the conversation on-site, and many friends and participants join online. But we must reflect that not every single individual, not all countries or places around the world would have the similar privilege to have the sufficient infrastructure support or financial support to enable them to travel around the world to meet people face to face. Not to say about for those low-income countries, they still suffer and struggle for infrastructure support in terms of the stable online learning environment. When universities and other tertiary education institutions in high-income and upper-middle-income countries gradually resume face-to-face learning, congratulations to them, and over 84% of the tertiary education students in lower middle-income countries are still out of school, according to the statistic last year. So this is some very brief statistic highlighting about the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic on school culture, and it certainly disrupts about student learning experience and teaching. And if you look into the number of students being closed down because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of students, they could not go to university, they could not go to high school, all around the world. The long-term impact and challenge will be increasing inequality in access to higher education and retention. And also at a risk, students are more likely to fall into the pandemic. When facing this pandemic, many countries around the world would mobilize and concentrate their resources in managing about the health issue first. And resources are always limited. National government, local government would have put the resources in managing the major crisis in terms of healthcare, and it is understandable public finance will be reduced for higher education. And many families, though some of them may have kept up their job and employment, because of the COVID's impact on the economy globally, many families could not support household funding support for their higher education, would lead to potential permanent closure of programs, resulting in permanent losses of human capital in academic and administrative positions. And when we celebrate about online learning on the one hand, this is very good to have, making use of the virtual environment for teaching and learning. But at the same time, we must look into the student learning experience and international research and surveys, examining about students' evaluation about learning experience through purely online. Most of the research indicate students' dissatisfaction. So one issue coming out from this COVID-19 pandemic, when we move ourselves more on virtual learning environment and online learning experience, will certainly raise the concern for everyone of us working in education to pay more attention to quality assurance and also the negative impact on welfare and interpersonal skills development. In one of the surveys regarding student learning experience, which I conducted a few-wave study in Asia, has indicated students, they are not happy about only online learning experience. When we deep in about the reasons why, one of the major reasons confronting them would be about the health issue, eye fatigue, for example. They're also worrying about only online learning will make them less interactive with persons, because the social dimension, the cultural interaction will be forming an important part of the whole person learning experience for individuals. And these are the following factors. I just won't go into all details, but just highlight when we celebrate on the one hand the virtual learning environment, online learning experience, but bear in mind there are also other factors challenging only online learning experience. Like discipline require hands-on experience, can find it hard to adjust to online teaching and learning. and increased workload cause deteriorating work conditions, or we also witness globally heightened occupational precarity and insecurity. Moving beyond teaching and learning, COVID-19 pandemic also affects tremendously about research. COVID-19 pandemic disrupted research activities due to restriction on scholar mobility. So I'm thankful today having face-to-face interaction with you. This is my first time out of this COVID-19 pandemic. But before the crisis, this is so easy for researchers. They engage in international, regional collaboration, cross-border for doing research. But mobility for faculty members has become one of the major challenges, especially for those lower income groups, countries. They may not have the sufficient resources in supporting of them. And in our research, we found those developing world suffer much because most of the universities are private, relying on external grants, or else in terms of collaboration with overseas universities in supporting them in terms of the research activities. But because of the closing border and also the decline in funding support would have affected not only about the learning, as I mentioned, it's also about the research activities. And three major areas being affected draw our attention is countries with limited infrastructure support, the earlier career researchers, and also the female researchers. This is not surprising when university leaders face about very tight budget. They close down capital project alone, and at the same time, they freeze a lot of positions. So early career researchers will face a lot of challenges for finding their placement for job. And also female researchers have to take care about family and household responsibility, also face tremendous challenge during the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. So this is some figures showing you about the regional disparity across around the world about research. And also people may say that, oh, on the one hand, we were affected by the COVID without sufficient traveling, but we may make use of the virtual environment to enable collaboration. Yes, thank you very much. Like my university in the last 2 years, we creatively make use of the technology-enabled environment for supporting research, continues to have a virtual exchange experience. But having said that, we also can acknowledge about the limitations if we are only talking about virtual collaboration. And the problem and misunderstanding are less likely to be resolved from distance, and the implementation of cooperation project is delayed, and contextualizing from a distant mode is difficult. And at the end, we have to how creative and innovative to put both face-to-face and virtual collaboration together is the way forward, especially when we are talking about we are dealing with the new normal. In what way we can make use of the virtual environment for supporting research, but at the same time, don't ignore the importance about face-to-face interaction, especially for those disciplines that really require on-site, exchange views. The impact in our research shows disproportionate impact. As I mentioned, institutional autonomy is also eroded as a combined result of political, economic changes. And we have to look at there's a high price of access to scholarly articles and books, creates obstacles preventing the fast circulation of knowledge to developing countries. In the more advanced countries, they can have the resources paying for open access. Open access of publications is becoming more popular. I'm so fortunate coming from a place which still have resources for supporting university research and education. So we do not shy away from using the resources for open access. But thinking about those countries, they may not be able to finance their daily operation. God bless me, how can they, finance open access in terms of publication? So I think UNESCO has a wonderful position to work with all different parts of the world in terms of higher education and government to see in what way we can collaborate together for making open access more available for those countries coming from less fortunate backgrounds. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic on higher education finance would increase about the disparity between universities, especially for those universities that are reliant on private sources of funding or donation or external grants. But even for established university system in the West, for those who are traditionally preferred destination for student mobility, they also face challenges. For example, one of the very popular places for overseas learning for student mobility is Australia. And we see a lot of challenges confronting Australian university, and similar happening about student mobility being disrupted, and finance of university, especially for those universities, they rely on international students as one of the major sources of funding. So despite government funding cuts and the drop of international students as an overall trend because of the closure of the traffic and also border, the elite universities still managed to attract international students during the pandemic. But how about those non-elite universities? They used to rely heavily on this sort of income from international students. It draws a lot of attention for managing university, not only in terms of finance, but also university governance matters. So this is some of the figures I want to highlight about economic impact of lost education review. The detail you go on with the paper published by UNESCO in full. And there are some suggestions for addressing the graduate employment because of the difficult time and in what way we can work together for enhancing our students to become more employable and also seeking employment support for them. Last but not least is about the international student mobility. And different forms of survey being conducted in the last 2 years, asking students' interest and motivation. And during the very difficult time at the beginning of the crisis, myself and my team also conducted a research on international student mobility with focus on Asian students. When we were hit by the COVID, student desires and motivation dropped significantly. But when the COVID situation has improved, and students began to have more interest to go overseas for learning. But what has also affected student mobility is not only about the border control. In the last 2 years, international media project and also reported a lot of students, especially from Asia, because of the different behavior and perception about public hygiene. So some of the students being discriminated purely because of the differences in perceptions and practices in healthcare. And it may create some kind of psychological barrier for students to consider overseas learning. And not to say about the emergence of the new geopolitics would have also affected student choices and also motivation for overseas studies. So these are the challenges I want to outline here. Countries with better pandemic control, such as some East Asian countries, will become potential major destinations for international students. But whether there's a regionalization of higher education, we have no answer for today, and more research should be done. But I also witness more regional, mobility rather than overseas mobility because of the conditions that I just outlined and highlighted above. Would there be any opportunity to enhance international learning through the virtual environment? I'm sure human beings are very clever, and our wisdom put together may make use of the virtual student mobility as an alternative. In what way we can marry virtual learning experience and also on-site with a beautiful hybrid system to enable students to have the internationalization of higher education on campus would become one of the major issues for educators, including all of you, to contemplate in future. I don't think we can go back to 2 years ago. Everything seems not have been disrupted, but in what way we could be very proactive and also creative by using the environment, which is virtual environment, for promoting student mobility and learning, could be one of the issues for further discussion. But at the end, we also have to acknowledge about the limitation of student mobility. I just outlined a few points here for consideration. And at the same time, we are lucky to have on-site and also online environment, but not all places around the world would have the benefit of this kind, we must be aware about the digital divide. The digital divide between the developed and the developing countries could influence the access to such programs and further worsen the educational stratification between the global north and global south, the very rich and the poor countries and systems. The virtual student mobility is also viewed as inferior to physical mobility by some students and employers, calling into question the sustainability of such program after the crisis. And one of the issues as educators gathering together to raise among ourselves, in what way we can give a due recognition for students they enroll into the virtual learning environment or online courses and programs as a primary learning experience. Would we accredit them as a normal, on-site learning experience? We still raise a lot of, concern because for the countries where I'm more familiar from my region, many of the university administrators and managers may not be thinking the same. So in what way we can rethink about the appropriate use of the virtual environment to make use of this, platform for enable student learning and recognize them properly. So these are some of the recommendations at the national level. Because of time running, so I won't go into the detail, and some of the institutional level. So I want to conclude by inviting more collaboration because, as I mentioned, this COVID-19 pandemic is truly a humbling experience. So I would like to call upon more collaboration together. I think in order to achieve the goal set out by UNESCO, leave no one in education, leave no one behind as our strategic goal for all. I think we need to put our brain together. We require additional effort, take more mileage to work together for a betterment of the whole world, especially to promote SDG 4, quality education and inclusive education. Thank you very much. And after my very brief introduction about setting the scene for today's roundtable, I'm glad I have a few distinguished panelists with me today. Let me introduce them to you first. I have Professor Jayendra Tilak, former professor and vice chancellor in India. Thank you. Yeah. And I also have Dr. Emma Sarensra. She is the head of the Higher Education Research and Policy Analysis UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you for joining us. Last but not least, Professor Roberto Condano, a president and Gallaudet University in the US. Thank you for joining us. So I know that they will draw from different experience, especially from different regions around the world, to share with you about their observation and analysis, to what extent the impact of COVID on the area that they are familiar. May I now invite Professor Tilak to go on the presentation. Okay.
Very distinguished participants, very distinguished panelists, and participants in person and participants online around the world. Buenos dias, and good morning to everyone. I feel it a very special privilege and an honor to participate in this UNESCO conference on a major theme with which the entire world is engulfed with. I'm particularly grateful to the UNESCO, Peter Wells, and also Professor Kaho Mok, the moderator, for kindly inviting me to this World Congress and particularly to this round table. I may repeat some of the aspects that Professor Kaho has stated, but I will not be as exhaustive as he is. Rather, I will confine to quite a few important aspects. And I will refer to a couple of aspects that India is, especially India from where I come, is especially doing with this. COVID, as you know, is in fact entirely truly global. Global in the sense that the entire world, perhaps excluding one or two very small countries, is caught up with this problem. And more than half the world population is inflicted with this COVID crisis, COVID. And more than 6 million people have died, according to the most recent estimates. And these numbers are unfortunately still growing. And as of now, today, still, I think 23 million active cases are there who need to be treated, whose future is uncertain. And almost every day, we are getting more than 500,000 new cases during the last couple of months. Hopefully, the situation will come down and become normal soon. But you also recognize how difficult is the hope to be realized. We are not still in the post-COVID period. We are still in the COVID period because COVID is still going on. The global health crisis is far from over, and so is the global crisis in higher education and research. Universities are facing really unprecedented challenges as a result of the COVID problem. We are standing at the crossroads of our past, present, and future. We are carrying historical baggage and knowledge into the current crisis, successfully or not satisfactorily so far. Meanwhile, our present experiences and the strategies that we are adopting today will be marked in history books, and they will be considered valuable by the future generations. And hence, any discussion on this would be very important for us. As everyone knows, the COVID has created the largest disruption of the education systems in the history of mankind. It affected in 2020, in the beginning of the crisis, more than 1.6 billion learners and 63 million teachers. It affected all levels of education, starting from pre-primary to higher education and research. And more than 190 countries in all continents of the world are a part of this. The closure of the schools in 2020 has affected 94% of the world's student population. And the proportion is higher, nearly 100% in low and middle-income countries. There are several issues, some of which Professor Kaho has referred to. But many believe that the education crisis will lead to a generational catastrophe of an unprecedented nature and magnitude. There will be a permanent loss in learning among the millions of children, young and adult, and that would be really irreparable. And there are also quite a few estimates of what would be the economic losses from this particular crisis. Some of these figures are in the beginning, but still I think we have more recent figures, which are still not very satisfactory. We find that still, even though 99% of the student population was affected in the beginning of the crisis, and about a year ago, that is 2021 April, with more than 40% of the student population was still affected. And we cannot say in 2022 May, we are in a better situation because 2021 was also a critical period with resurgence of the problem. The COVID has affected almost all continents of the world, and also it did not discriminate between the rich and the poor countries. In the beginning, almost all countries were equally affected, with nearly 99 to 100% of the students being affected. But the strategies that were adopted by different countries have made a difference, and there we find quite difference between low-income countries and high-income countries. High-income countries are slightly better off, perhaps today, compared to many low and middle-income countries. 84% of the lower middle-income countries are still affected. 84% of the students in lower middle-income countries are still affected by this. I think many countries have adopted different kinds of strategies, some of which are very, very common. Almost unanimously, there was national and global lockdowns, and the first thing that was adopted was schools closures, without any second thoughts. And that continued for a very long period. And at the second stage, it was realized by all the countries in the world that it's not possible to get rid of this COVID completely, and we have to learn to live with this problem. And that's the only option. And hence, almost all countries took up online learning as an important strategy of at least reducing the intensity of the problems. So like work from home, teach from home, and learn from home have been the slogans, or have been the practices. But the online methods that we adopted were not as efficient as one expects, because they were crisis-driven emergency remote learning measures. All of a sudden were introduced without sufficiently good planning. At the third point stage, there was partial reopening, and there was consideration of blended learning, and there are some experiments that are already being made and still being made. And even though some countries have fully reopened, but I think still the situation is normal. And we do not know whether we get back to the old normal or we'll have a new normal in the years to come. While there are several effects of this crisis on higher education, I think some of which are very, very important. One is, of course, on the teaching and learning of the students in the universities and colleges. An equally important aspect that was affected very drastically was the research environment, research facilities, and research studies. The enrollments of students, not only international students, but also in the domestic education systems, the enrollment suffered. I think that's a particular issue that has to be taken into consideration, because many policy analysts and policy documents concentrated more on international students. But I think it's also important to look at the domestic students, what has happened during this crisis and what will happen later. The fourth important effect that we find is on the public finances and also household finances, apart from private finances for higher education. And there are various kinds of evidences. Some countries really protecting their education systems, but many countries, particularly low and lower income countries, not being able to do. Household funding for higher education has come down in most countries of the world. Shakropoulos and others have estimated that the economic losses could be as high as $30.7 trillion, with a very serious long-term implication for the GDP growth. And that's one of the highest estimates that we find. But the general estimate was around 20%. It was $20 trillion by quite a few experts. I think there are four important issues or strategies that were focused and that received wide attention. One is the online learning. As I said, that's the only option that was available to us in the beginning, and that is still considered as the most important option today we have. In the beginning of the crisis, we have something like 2/3 of the institutions replaced physical classroom teaching completely by online methods, according to the IAU survey. In 2021, 89% of the higher educational institutions worldwide offer online teaching programs, and they have some blended programs also. The second important aspect that received wide attention was the international students. More than half the institutions of higher education in the world experienced a very significant fall in enrollments of international students. International students coming from close in the region and also from far-off regions of the world. Third, 1/3 of the higher education institutions in the world experienced a very significant decline in public funding for higher education. And 35% of the higher education institutions in Europe, which we expected to be much better off with the lower figures. And more than half the institutions in other regions of the world are very, very worried about the financial stability of their higher education institutions in the near future. And that's a grave problem that we have. Even within respect to the domestic educational system, the enrollments have fallen, and there are big dropouts in a good number of countries and a sizable number of countries. These are the four issues that received a lot of attention. There are many domestic higher education, keeping international students aside for a while, we find that a good number of higher education institutions found a significant decline in the enrollments. And that decline was steep in Africa, followed by Americas. And the decline is somewhat modest in the European countries. In the census, 13% of the higher education institutions in European countries have a similar problem, compared to 36% in Africa. The question is whether the online learning method is an important one, whether it will be attractive enough to get the international and domestic students. The QS survey has made a very quick survey and found that the answer is a clear no. Many international students will not be interested in online education or distance education. In fact, more than 80% of the students are extremely or very much interested in in-person education, the traditional type that we were having. And more than half the students are marginally interested or least interested in online and distance education programs. So is the case with respect to the other methods that we adopted, whether it's adoption of MOOCs as an additional tool or as a blended model as a whole. The preference is much less. We don't have sufficient evidence with respect from such a survey from domestic students, but we don't expect significant differences because the large preference is still for in-person education, and online learning could be only a short gap, or could at best be a supplementary one. Because some of the negatives and some of the positive aspects of online learning are very well known. And the positive aspect is it can be potentially inclusive. Potential is an important one, not necessarily practically, because it can be accessible to anybody in the entire world. And it can be cost efficient in the delivery of educational material and education. It can also be environmental friendly. But I think the negative aspects of online learning are very well known. And one that we experienced during the COVID crisis in the entire world, including the rich countries, was the big digital divide. A large sections of the students were not able to have basic infrastructure that is necessary for effective online learning. And the problem is most serious in the low-income countries. As a result, we ended up with inequalities of different kinds, regional inequalities, inequalities between social groups of population, inequalities between the poor and the rich, and inequalities between different countries and within the countries, between different regions. Online learning is also having problems with respect to this kind of security and privacy that will be guaranteed. But I think the more important aspect that we find is the loss of human touch in the entire education system would be a very serious one. And the teachers and the teaching profession will be deprofessionalized completely. And knowledge would be looked into in a fragmented way, and the academic labor would be looked into a normal labor work. Higher education system could be really casualized, or it will be subject to casualized labor systems. That would be a very, very dangerous problem, dangerous, innovative that's possible. We also find that a large number of higher education institutions experience a significant decline in public funding, whether it is tuition fees, whether it is private sector funding, or whether it is other sources of income. I think with respect to all aspects of funding, a good number of institutions have suffered very significantly. And interestingly, while Africa, America, and Asia and Pacific suffered most, the suffering was, as expected, least in European countries. The second important aspect that we find is research is very severely affected. A very good number of institutions, as many as 2/3 to 3/4 of the institutions, found that they could not travel for conferences, they could not travel for field work, and they have no access to laboratories, libraries, and other resources. Staff are, of course, are expected to spend more time on preparing for online teaching methodologies. There was a decline in research funds, there is a decline in fellowships, and there is a decline in PhD production levels. There is a decline in patents. There is a general decline in publications, and there is a general decline in the international publications of the faculty and the students over the years. In a normal period, we didn't find such a significant declines, but I think these numbers are very, very serious. Among the many aspects that we have some evidence, we find that Africa suffered the most, and the higher education institutions in America and Asia Pacific, the next ones, and Europe suffered the least. But with respect to international students, international mobility, I think Europe suffered the most, and America and the other countries suffered the least, partly because many of those systems are not so much dependent upon international students as the countries in European region. What I feel is the issues that require very serious attention are not only international education, but much more important to the entire education system, entire higher education system domestically, and domestic policies. Because the inequalities that were highlighted, that came into sharp contrast now, are so serious that any neglect of those inequalities will cause serious damage to the higher education system. We have to provide access to good quality education, both to the conventional education system and also to the digital infrastructure. As I said, the digital infrastructure is extremely unevenly distributed among the populations. We also have to provide really good mechanisms of student support, emotional support and financial support. And both are important, perhaps not only for the students, but also for the teachers. And teachers also require training. And of course, many countries have to go for large-scale recruitment as many teachers have left academic profession. The third important aspect that the countries have to focus is how to protect the higher education systems from cuts in public funding. And that's an important challenge and major challenge. And I find in all this, it is the public higher education system that needs very special focus, because that is the system that survived for a very long period. And that's the bedrock of the entire higher education system. I also said, of course, you have to really consider about the international students and the global mobility of the students, essentially because that's also an important method of international learning, improving the learning environment in the entire world. There are no short routes for rebuilding the higher education systems. Done. I'm done. And it's very important to recognize that short-term compulsions often lead us to make major compromises on the long-term policies, and that would be really costly. In fact, we should be very, very careful in preparing the strategies in such a way that these short-term compulsions will not dictate and will not ruin our long-term ideals and long-term paths of development. What is that we require for the long-term vision for a higher education system? A vision that will develop higher education, a system of higher education that will create a different and a better world, equal, inclusive, and qualitatively good world. Universities should reposition themselves more strongly and visibly as key drivers and agents of change. And that's a message that missed in the recent years. We need strong foundations to be laid for robust and higher education and research institutions in almost all countries of the world, both rich and poor, and they should be engaged in long-term planning of the higher education systems. There are some positive changes that have taken place during the last couple of years, and we should sustain those positive changes. And we should also find out effective solutions to the persistent and newly emerging challenges that the higher education systems are facing, and identify the needed structural changes. And in the long period, we need a well-balanced higher education system, a balanced educational system, balance between different disciplines, balance between different cultures, balance between different areas of study, and balance between research and higher education. And we also need to address the challenges that these digital inequalities or digital divide has created in the recent past. Let me conclude with one or two simple quotes. And we should recognize, as United Nations stated, education and science are a vaccine for the pandemic. And unfortunately, education and science were affected by the pandemic. But we should see that that's a solution for the pandemic. And higher education is the key to building back better post-COVID society in the years to come. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tilak, for overseeing about the impact of COVID on different aspects of higher education and reminding us about the importance about education for the better world. So next speaker is Professor Roberta Condano. So it's your floor.
Wonderful. So first I wanted to thank you so much for the previous presentations. We heard some very good information that was very helpful summaries that spoke to the impact of higher education. At Gallaudet University, for those of you who may not know anything about Gallaudet, we are the only university in the entire world, and sadly continue to be the only university in the world that provides instruction through sign language, in our case it's American Sign Language, and English. We consider ourselves to be a bilingual university. So one of the things that I wanted to mention to you that really was helpful in our survival through this pandemic is that I am the first deaf female president of Gallaudet University in the history of the institution. We were established in 1864. Thank you. Our first deaf president of the university was selected in 1988. Actually, not that long ago, if you think about it. We've had 4 deaf presidents since that first one, and again, since our establishment in 1864. So what's important to know that the leadership team of Gallaudet that served for the president when I first came to the university were made up of all individuals who were hearing and primarily males. In fact, just before the pandemic began, our executive team became majority deaf-led and female-led. This truly was a critical turning point in terms of our ability to innovate during the pandemic, to be able to show everyone that leadership matters. Leadership matters when it comes to innovation that's required of everyone, which was a very important lesson for us. At Gallaudet University, we are a liberal arts university, and I'm responsible for educating students from birth all the way through their doctoral degrees, as well as lifelong learning. We serve the world in this capacity. We have international students who come to Gallaudet, and we serve our nation. Primarily, our funding comes from Congress, the United States Congress. And one of the things that I wanted to really emphasize here is we talk a lot about public funding. And what I can share with you is that in America, we are very fortunate at Gallaudet University to get this congressional support. Federal support, about $164 million was given to us, with $8 million of that supporting our students and $64 million providing support to the university. So direct funding to our students and our families during the pandemic was provided by the federal government. We certainly had to pivot our learning for our K through 12 programs, our elementary programs, as well as our university programs, as many did here. But unlike most universities in America, in March of 2020, we immediately knew, just because of the fact that a substantial number of our students came from families whose incomes were $50,000 or less, for a family of 4, that represents, in fact, 70% of our student body come from low-income families. So we knew early on in March of 2020 that we couldn't send the students home and hope they would return in 3 weeks at some point in time through the pandemic, as many universities in America expected to do. So we knew that we would not be able to keep our students for the rest of the semester, and then that went on to be a full year. But a couple of things that I wanted to emphasize here is this first, the notion of accessibility. For us, that pivot that we made to online learning was very successful. As a university, we were successful in pivoting this way because we have been very accustomed to using digital technologies for much longer than many others here in the room. And I can say that's true for many in America. We've been using video phones to communicate for 20 years now. We've been using texting abilities for probably 60 years now in different capacities with different technologies. So for us, making that pivot to a virtual experience was nothing that was too difficult. We fairly easily were able to pivot and go into more virtual settings. The biggest challenge, though, for us was around access to Wi-Fi, internet support, and also to the economic inequalities that our families experienced. So when our children were sent home to learn from home, learning was impacted, of course, by their home environments. And for deaf children, they have a significantly more of an impact. When they come to Gallaudet, they have access to communication and sign language at all times. But 90% of our students come from families who are hearing, meaning they use a spoken language and not a signed language. So those students going back to those family environments were impacted significantly because in their home environments, no one was signing and communicating with them as they did at Gallaudet University. So what's so very important is the environment of the university really matters to the university's students' learning experience. We provide full accessibility, visual language accessibility to our students 24/7. Now, from a global perspective, and what I'll share with you here, our international students who go to other universities have a different experience. You know, you provide language immersion experiences to students who come to your universities from other countries, and they come to your universities because they want a full immersive experience. Likewise, we provide a language immersive experience for our international and our American students, having access to sign language at our university. So it's very challenging to replace that language immersive experience virtually. One other thing that I wanted to emphasize here as I was watching the other presentations, faculty's preparation for online learning prior to the pandemic, we only had about 10% of our faculty who were trained and certified to teach online. But during the summer of 2020, we invested financially a substantial amount of money in faculty training. 98% of our faculty became certified in teaching online during that summer after the pandemic began. During the next academic year, we taught virtually again, and our successes improved because of the experiences our faculty had teaching and learning, and our students as well. 5 years before the pandemic, our students of color at Gallaudet were seeing strides in retention rates. We were able to retain more and more students of color, and those numbers continued to increase over the years. During the pandemic, we saw those numbers decline in terms of student of color retention. And honestly, there were two main factors for that being the case. One being economic, and the other was the student's home environment and the lack of language access at home. And of course, that parallel is not lost on me here. I think many of you have the same kind of experiences. We think about the fact that there's economic disparities, lack of support in students' home for academic learning is also prevalent. So families that are not from higher education settings or don't have that experience in their family environment, they find it more difficult to be able to support their students. Many of those families are out trying to raise money to support their family and have difficulties in able to provide instructional support. So these impacts were fairly significant. Strangely enough, though, our retention rates for our students who returned to our campus when we went back to in-person learning, our retention rates from the spring to just this past fall, again, when we returned to in-person learning, was the second highest in Gallaudet's history, 85%. Because we knew students wanted to return to in-person learning. It was very evident that that was the case. I can add as well that our ability to innovate at Gallaudet is made possible because of the significant partnerships that we've formed. We have partnerships with Apple. And so when we made that pivot to the online setting, we were able to distribute free iPads and equipment to our students. Wi-Fi support was made available to them. They had Wi-Fi cards that they could connect to. And then also Zoom worked with us at Gallaudet. And I don't know about you, but I know that the earlier versions of Zoom were very, very challenging for us. Zoom is based and designed only for spoken languages to be used. So every time someone would speak, the interpreters would suddenly disappear from the screen because the camera would automatically go to the person who was speaking. Well, as deaf people, we don't speak, we don't use our voices, we're communicating in sign language. So whenever the speaker would shift, the interpreter or access to the interpreter would no longer be available. So meeting between deaf people and hearing people, we found many challenges, and that's why Gallaudet began working with Zoom. We got our research efforts involved in that as well. So technology access was very challenging in the early stages. I think there were many companies who had done a lot of work to improve their experiences for all users, not just individuals who use sign language. So I could go on a lot about this, but we've had just an amazing experience in many ways. I think the data that you've shown, I won't repeat here, there are very similar numbers in terms of our university students' experiences. But one thing that hasn't been shared yet today that I'd like to share is the differences that were made in the decisions that we had to face. Again, our work wasn't done despite the fact that we shifted to online learning. And all of this was basically guided by our values. The CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, spoke at Gallaudet's commencement last Friday. And, you know, really the way he spoke to values is exactly how Gallaudet has been leading. We are very much a values-driven university. And would like to share with you today some of the values that we used as members of our executive team in March 2020 that we were able to use in order to make decisions and will continue to use so that all of our decisions are based on these values. I think UNESCO should be very clear about the higher education recommendations going forward, always understanding the values that will guide those decisions. As we see things change so rapidly on a daily basis, so there are many disruptors now in our world today, economic, political, social disruptors, and the list goes on and on. COVID is one of those ones that truly amplified all of the disruptors that were already in place. It's just an amplifier of those disruptors. So I'd like to share with you our values. The first value is around our need to cherish each member of our community. Each and every member should be cherished. Secondly, promoting language vibrancy and the value of our bilingual community. And for those of you who may not understand, we speak about language vibrancy, and that's unique to Gallaudet because it's our ability to be able to see visually access to sign language at all times, whether it's virtual or in person. Third is a focus on health and safety and well-being for everyone. Our fourth value was centered around the value of creativity and adaptability. The fifth value was making sure that we met each individual's needs equitably. The next value was our commitment to academic continuity and stability, and the commitment to open communication to everyone on our campus community. And the last was that we're in this together. You know, for me, just the historic value of deaf people coming together as we act collectively together as a culture to maintain our survival of our signing community, our visual community, both in America and around the world. I don't think many of you here realize how connected we are as signing deaf people. If any one of you in the audience from whatever country you're from were to give me the name of a deaf person in your respective country, I would guarantee you I could find probably maybe one other deaf person who would be able to reach the person that you gave me the name of, probably as quickly as tomorrow. That's how tight-knit our community is throughout the world. So many of you who are here today, you may not realize that in America, we have identified American Sign Language to be, well, it was identified as a language in the 1960s. That's fairly recent. And of course, you know, it was called before that spoken language on the hands or referred to as language used by animals. But we have found that there are over 200 to 300 other sign languages around the world that have yet to be documented. And your academic institutions probably know very little, if not anything, about us. So this is an invitation to all of you to get to know Gallaudet University, to understand how we can work with you and learn together. In this high-flex world and the environment we live within today, bilingual visual learning is an asset to your deaf and hard of hearing and deaf-blind students. We have a lot to offer the world. Again, we're the only one of its kind in the world. We'd like to be able to share with you through technologies, through teaching and instruction, our visual strategies that have been very effective for both deaf and hearing students alike. And I think that concludes my time, so thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Roberta. A very congratulations to you. Because of your leadership, you demonstrate the real evidence on your campus in supporting about UNESCO's strategic goal, leaving no one behind. Congratulations again. So, Emma, now is your floor.
Take that. Oh, you don't have the PPT. Okay.
So greetings, everybody. A very warm welcome to the Third World Higher Education Conference. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists for doing the hard work of explaining many of the global issues that we've faced over the last 2 years as we're into this COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to ask you, what have we learned during those 2 years? Is online teaching and learning here to stay? Are our institutions better prepared for future crises? So since the onset of the pandemic, at UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, where I'm based, we've been closely following the impact of the pandemic on higher education, not only in our region of Latin America and the Caribbean, but around the world. We've published, for example, an impact analysis of COVID-19 policy responses. That was quite early on in the pandemic, conducted a survey of 100 Latin American universities, mapped institutional closures and reopenings in the region and developed case studies covering 73 higher education institutions in 38 countries that have innovated with virtual student mobility, which we've already referred to this morning. So building on this, over the past year, we've also been developing a global report, and I'm delighted to be able to officially launch it right here, right now with you, as we enter into this discussion in this highly topical, still topical, roundtable on the impact of COVID-19. So our report, which is called Resuming or Reforming, Tracking the Global Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Higher Education After 2 Years of Disruption, which is now available on the UNESCO ESALC website, offers a comprehensive overview of the impact of the pandemic on all aspects of higher education's functioning, administration and management, teaching and learning, research, and of course internationalization, which we've talked about today and we talk about in the report, primarily through the lens of international student mobility, where we've seen the most obvious disruptions. So through extensive research, we've been able to bring together, we believe for the first time, over 50 examples and experiences from over 40 countries in all world regions. We're also able to draw from some of the many brilliant institutional, national, regional, and even in some cases other international studies on the impact of the pandemic and put them in one place in this report. So I'll try in the next few minutes just to give you a flavor of some of the findings and give some examples from Latin America and the Caribbean, although, as I mentioned, the report contains examples which are truly global, and I'm also thankful to our colleagues today for bringing forward some of those cases already. So in the area of administration and management, for example, we found that despite their past experiences of dealing with external crises, many higher education institutions were still unprepared for the COVID-19 disruption. The evidence that we found suggests that most crisis teams that were created in universities and colleges and higher education institutions worldwide were actually only set up in the initial days of the pandemic. Institutions have also had to react rapidly to adapt administrative and student support processes. And one very strong and clear example, I think, in response to the rise in mental health issues among students and staff and faculty, institutions have made efforts to continue providing counselling and mental health services online and the period in which campuses were shut down. So we know, for example, that one university in the Dominican Republic was able to reopen a previously discontinued hotline to provide psychological support during this period. So when we talk about teaching and learning, obviously the major reaction that we've seen, and a pretty global one, was the need to swiftly transition to online platforms, and our previous speakers have outlined that both at institutional and international level as well. So while this change was astonishing, truly astonishing in its global spread and rapidity, it also underscored a number of ongoing challenges in higher education, which, as we've mentioned, the pandemic has amplified. So in Colombia, for example, students initiated a protest using Twitter, using social media, demanding a cut in their tuition fees because they were unsatisfied with the quality of online learning. So I think we have to keep quality at the forefront of our considerations as we move forward. It's also true that in many regions, switching to online was challenging, perhaps because the infrastructure wasn't available, and perhaps because teachers were unable to be prepared because of a lack of time, perhaps because of a lack of experience in digital pedagogies. We know that in Peru, for example, the government aimed to address this by organizing training to enhance digital competencies in all 52 universities in the country, reaching over 5,000 professors and 15,000 students. When it comes to research, we found that on a positive side, there was an increased trust in science and scientific research because of its connections to the search for solutions to the ongoing health crisis. And as we saw many academics and institutions taking the initiative to battle misinformation and the fake news. So steps were taken also to incorporate scientists into advisory groups working with government. So in Jamaica, there was a multi-stakeholder committee within the country's framework of essential national health research, and that was able to mobilize and were also factors behind this increased trust. The corollary, though, has been that vaccine development and COVID-related studies have overtaken research agendas, leaving other fields with substantially less or even no financial support. We found, for example, a study from Brazil which identified, having looked at 114 of the country's public universities, nearly 800 projects related to COVID-19. 35% of those were focused on protective equipment, vaccines and tests as areas that have been identified as priorities. So I think what we're seeing here is this very welcome and sudden shift towards focusing research efforts on COVID-19 and related areas, but perhaps also to the detriment of other research areas which may be equally important in different ways. It's also become evident, as Kaho mentioned earlier, that female researchers who are already underrepresented in academia, especially as we go into more senior positions, faced additional challenges due to the uneven distribution of the pandemic's effects. So it was reported in Argentina from a study that female academics felt greater stress levels and pressures because they had less time for research, since, on average, they take on most of the caring responsibilities and household duties. So when it comes to international students, they represent the group that's been most affected within the larger dimension of higher education internationalization. In Europe, a study found that 73% of universities had their outbound and inbound academic mobility programs disrupted, and in Latin America, and of course in other regions, the proportions are similar. On the other hand, the pandemic, we think, finally expedited an increase in virtual student mobility as a plausible alternative, supplement, additional form of mobility beyond just physical mobility. And indeed, we've also been doing research at UNESCO on virtual student mobility and have found that most students, if given the chance to do virtual student mobility again, would take up that opportunity. So as the pandemic continues to unfold, as we've heard today, the pandemic is not yet over, I'm sorry to say. Its lasting effects on all areas of higher education are far from settled. However, and as we suggest in our new report, two key elements are perhaps already evident. First, the rapid return to in-person teaching and learning and the partial stabilization of enrollment patterns suggests that the changes of 2020 and 2021 may not lead to a fundamental transformation in the current understanding of higher education as a face-to-face endeavor. Second, the resumption of academic-related travel also points to the return of pre-pandemic era practices when it comes to academic mobility. We hope, though, that these reversing trends will not be a lost opportunity to make much-needed progress towards the democratization of internationalization and in harnessing technology for good in higher education. So if those are areas that perhaps may not change as fundamentally, what might stick from these past 2 years? Having demonstrated their ability to pivot online at a speed and at a depth that might have seemed surprising, our report suggests that higher education institutions are likely to continue at least some of these digitalization or digitalized practices in the long term. But let me finish with this. We know that the pandemic has exposed multiple levels of inequalities that in higher education include differential treatment of students based on their background, closed access to knowledge and research results at a time when we ever more need open science, unevenness in global patterns of research collaboration, and lack of access to the basic requirements of digitalized higher education, such as devices, internet access, electricity. The urgency of addressing these inequities must be kept at the forefront as higher education and as we all here at this conference begin to think ahead, to think about how we together must and can create a more equitable post-pandemic world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for sharing about the new reports your team and you have conducted. It's good news for everyone. We can learn from you more with the report. So now I think we have some conversation among the panelists. I would like to open the discussion with the floor. I just wonder whether we have any comments and questions from the floor. The floor is open.
If I may.
Okay. Yeah, please.
If I could just make one comment. You know, I had the conversation not that long ago with some of the vice presidents who are responsible for the student affairs portion of higher education that we provide in our region in the United States, particularly in the District of Columbia. One thing that was emphasized in this conversation, in fact, one vice president was explaining to the rest of us that we will likely see a 10-year impact on learning for our students, not just academic, but social and developmental learning and mental health as well. So when I ask this person, I mean, if I think about it, we have some students who are young, 5-year-olds in kindergarten, and these students experienced the COVID pandemic. Actually, it used to be that kindergartners were the most preferred class to teach, and so many teachers preferred to teach the younger students as opposed to older students. And we talked about what will the world look like for them in 10 or 20 years from now. And this individual said, now I don't want to depress all of you as presidents, but in fact, this is not a 10-year impact that will be experienced. It's probably a good 20-year impact. So we have to be thinking 20 years ahead. What adaptations do we need to make now for the cognitive, educational, social impact based on the age and the person's cognitive levels? We have to make sure that we draw upon social scientists to understand how COVID has impacted children's brains at their given level. How will it affect their social, learning, and cognitive abilities as then we see them in higher education institutions 20 years down the road? So we have a lot to do to think about research on the brain and what COVID has done in terms of impacting these children's lives.
Well, certainly I think this is a very important point, and when we discuss about the impact of COVID on higher education, I want to echo what Emma has just mentioned. I think the well-being and the mental health of students is one of the key issues. We came across a study conducted about a year ago asking about students, they are on their overseas learning and among 26 countries or regions. And one of the major issues would be about they face about the challenges is not only about the stress, but also about institutional support that they receive is not sufficient. So when we are talking about investment in higher education, not only about research and learning and teaching facilities, but more importantly, I think it's about, as to what you just mentioned about the counseling. I think positive psychology and well-being part should be strengthened. So Emma, do you have further comment on that aspect?
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to say also it's so valuable to hear from the institutional perspective so that we can take this sort of multifaceted approach to this. I gave just one example, and of course there would be hundreds more that we could draw on of higher education institutions taking their own initiatives to either bolster support that was already available or to add in new services. But this, we have to remember, has been taking a case against a very difficult context from an institutional leadership perspective, from the perspective of students who are often studying in very different locations or attempting to study in very different locations from where they typically have been able to. So I think you're right to underline that as one of perhaps the key learning points for us from the pandemic.
So Tila, in your presentation, you talk about the student survey. Most of the students prefer going back to on-site, despite the fact that we celebrate success in the virtual learning experience. So to you, what do you think about what we should do at the government level in terms of addressing the survey you just outlined in your talk?
See, some countries have extensive infrastructure for digital education. And perhaps they may be successful to a great extent. But even those cases, I do not think that these new forms of education, virtual model of education, can replace the traditional model altogether. So we need to have some kind of a good blended system in those countries. But in many other countries, the digital infrastructure is extremely poor. Yeah. Even to think of any blended model of any reasonable proportions, that would be really a very tough task. So I think we have to really go back and try to get the old normal to become the normal, where the traditional system of teacher-student in a physical classroom is still very effective and very dominant. Okay. That I think there is no choice for that. We can use only the digital technology as an additional supplementary method, but certainly not as a replacement for a good educational system. Because the personal relations between the teacher and the student, between the student and the student, the interpersonal relations, the peer effects, etc., are very, very significant in students' personality development and thereby to the society's development.
Okay, thank you. I just wonder whether audience in the floor, do you have any comments and question or sharing your experience in responding or managing COVID and your institutions? Yeah, please, this gentleman. Can anyone offer the microphone?
There's no provision. There's no provision.
Yeah, please. Can someone offer the microphone to this gentleman in the middle? Yeah, someone is moving to you.
Or ask him or her to come to the front and speak, and you repeat the question.
Is someone going down?
The digital tools are
Okay,
unevenly spread.
could you please come over, then we can listen to you? Okay, can I use your microphone? Yeah, here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a short question. Efrem Mills from the University of Salamanca. We have somehow suffered also the consequences of COVID while we are teaching. So the question to you is, yes, of course, the blended system is good, but now let's go to the practical ground. The experience we have had has shown that face-to-face teaching system is the unique one, in my opinion, in order to have a global education. But are we not going somehow toward a danger to shifting from the face-to-face or the blended to the virtual system? Because now many universities, especially the private ones, are really fostering this part. So how can we focus on those values that really characterize the higher education system as a whole?
Thank you very much for a very important question, whether we can just replace face-to-face, okay, by virtual environment learning. Okay, Tilak, could you respond first? Yeah.
I think that's a very important question, and that is happening. In fact, some of the private universities in India and also perhaps in quite a few other countries are trying to do aggressively adopt these methods as a replacement for the traditional method. But many public universities do not do, maybe because they believe in the philosophy of education on the one side and also because of perhaps lack of sufficient infrastructure. But I think in these private universities also perhaps it will be a very difficult proposal to say that that will be a sustainable method for good learning in the long run. As the QS survey has stated, students, if you ask a question whether you want to prefer this or this, they have a very clear choice. The compulsions may be different, but the student's choice is very, very clear. And the student choice is, I think, much more rational, particularly on this aspect, and we should value that.
Yeah, thank you. Roberta.
Right, if I could comment, you know, one thing that's emerging is this notion of high flex as an option. And I think the question is far more complex than just an either-or scenario. I know one thing that I've learned, I actually taught a class this last spring at the university, and I was fascinated by the students who tested positive for COVID. They were still able to participate in class because of the high flex option. They could log in virtually even though they were COVID positive, staying in their home environment, and there was no learning loss in their ability to be able to participate in the class. So that's one thing I think we all need to work together to explore more, is how can high flex education be an option? Can we use it to promote the reduction of inequities for learning opportunities and teaching opportunities, even among our faculty? You know, because the faculty also have challenges they face with their own health, with their own family situations, where coming to work may be a challenge for them, and they could still teach for an hour despite that. They could provide family caregiving, whether it's elder care or child care, but there are certain things that we need to consider about the positive aspects that we can learn from high-flex environments. My only concern is that the technology is not free and it's not available. Yeah. So we need the governments and countries to strategize around ways to ensure that our educational environments provide the necessary technologies that are needed for that kind of flexibility in learning. So I just wanted to further emphasize that this is also an equalizer for many students. And we've heard from the students at Gallaudet, them saying that, you know, they have to go home and take care of their family members, and yet they still want to be able to continue their education. So there are certain factors we have to consider that are more complicated, especially as we go down the road a bit. And the need for interactive, in-person learning is invaluable just for so many reasons. I mean, mental health reasons are just one of them. The social environment is what supports a person's mental health, and so we have to ensure that that in-person learning also is supplied with or providing mental health support as well. We can't distinguish one from the other, but it has to be blended, and that's why I would encourage us not to separate mental health experiences and support from the learning environment, because the social environments of our campus are very much about and speak to and support the mental health of our students and well-being.
Thank you. Emma.
Actually, that provides a beautiful background for what I wanted to sort of respond and say, which is that when we're thinking about, you know, traditional versus new, I think perhaps if we can think beyond that and try to put students at the very center of everything that we're doing in higher education, and how is it that we are supporting those students to become the best people that they can be, whether that's preparing them for jobs, preparing them for life, in other ways as well. And in that sense, we have to look at different modalities for supporting teaching and learning. We have to look at different modalities for supporting research. We have to look at different modalities for enabling students to benefit from cross-cultural exchange. So when we think, for example, about virtual forms of student mobility, while of course there are a number of technological barriers and issues which have yet to be dealt with, on the other hand, as I mentioned, we could see this also as a real step towards democratization of internationalization. We talk a lot about the rise in the number of international students, of course, in the pre-pandemic period, and you know, the 5 million figure, I think, is quite well known. But actually, if you look at that as a proportion of the global tertiary student population, that's 3%. 3% of higher education students are physically mobile globally. So think how, with a reimagined and more creative approach to cross-cultural exchange and mobility, we could expand that figure exponentially.
Well, definitely, I would like to thank the panelists for getting together for a very wonderful discussion today for this important topic. I think we are still being influenced by the COVID pandemic. I don't think we've gone beyond that. But together, I think we can make a better world for our students. I echo what Emma, you just mentioned, put our students central to our business, because we are doing education, preparing our graduates, the young people, for uncertain futures. And in what way we can equip our students, our youth, our young people, they all have hope for future. I think this is important for every one of us to move beyond our own box, to think about creatively and innovatively by adopting appropriate measures. So whether they are virtual form of learning, technology-enabled platform, or different form of face-to-face experience. Core to our business is to support UN's call for leave no one behind. So I would like to thank all of you for joining this roundtable, and I expect more conversation will be having on in this conference. But I was told that time is nearly up, so may I thank the panelists again. Thank you. And also thank you for your participation. We look forward to having more conversation during tea break or during other sessions. Thank you very much.